be sure to follow me on Instagram. There you can hang out with me and talk to me directly. Okay, so we are getting into Justice League, the Justice Doom War. And initially I thought doing this video, like doing this story arc as a singular story arc unto itself. But for a lot of people who are reading either Year of the Villain or just the Justice League events itself, or at least getting caught up, it can all be really confusing, right? In terms of like Perpetua and the multiverse and all these forces and everything that are going on. And so the cool thing about this is that while other writers like Joshua Williamson is writing The Flash and he's using like, there's kind of the induction of these other forces, the Still Force and Sage Force and so on and so forth, we're going to kind of ignore that, not insofar as it's not in continuity or not in existence. I mean, it is, but we're going to kind of ignore what's going on there, and we're going to focus strictly on what's happening here, because what Scott Snyder really does is essentially explain it all. And the reality of this is kind of the question, why did DC wait so long? And this really kind of reveals it in terms of the events going on here. But the cool thing about it is that this really picks up with the idea between the Justice League and the Legion of Doom going to war against each other. And in reality, that's how it is that the events of Year of the Villain are set up, right? Like, Year of the Villain is interesting insofar as like, the offer of Lex Luthor, right? Basically, like, he travels around from place to place to various villains essentially and offers them, makes the offer like, do they want to join his Legion of Doom? The Joker turned it down, and a lot of them have turned it down, but a lot of them have also accepted it too. And so as a result of that, it's basically, the offer set of events, or the offer storyline in DC is really more just like backup features, like one page, or 2-page parts at the end of a story where Lex Luthor is basically building up his own Legion of Doom. That's really all it is. And in reality, I wouldn't have called it like Year of the Villain. I would have just called it like The Rise of the Legion of Doom or something like that, and it just would have tied into and made a lot more sense in terms of like, if only, only because of its namesake. But at the very least here, with Lex Luthor forming his own Legion of Doom for the purpose of basically serving Perpetua, and then the Justice League standing against him, that's kind of where things are at the moment. So what this does is it actually picks up seemingly like with the war seemingly over, right? Like the Legion of Doom having basically won. And what's cool about this is we get this depiction of Lex Luthor, who basically uses all these forces at his disposal, right? Like the Still Force, the Ultraviolet Lantern Force. Those of you guys who are unfamiliar, remember, the Ultraviolet Lanterns are basically lanterns who can bring out essentially the worst in people, right? Like all their raw negative emotions are all kind of brought to the surface. Unlike most of the other Lantern Corps that really get their power from a central power battery, the Ultraviolet Lantern Corps is basically fed by Umbrax, this being that existed outside the source wall, and then once the source wall was broken, made its way into the main DC universe. Again, we've got a video on like what the Ultraviolet Lanterns are, so you'll find that down in the description if you want a more nuanced and a more detailed explanation there. But the long and short of it is that everything that's going on right now, that is to say Lex Luthor basically killing all the members of the Justice League, basically destroying any opposition that he has, is really more of a vision of sorts that's given to them by Will Payton, by Starman, right? And this is important because what it does is it basically shows the Justice League, this is what you guys are going to be dealing with. This is what you guys are going to be coping with at the moment. This is how bad things are popping off. And so with the way this plays out, it's really interesting. The way this plays out is Will Payton basically says like in order to essentially pull this off, if we face off against Lex Luthor as he stands now, we'll lose, just because of the fact that the fraction of the totality, the device that basically allowed him to essentially bring back Perpetua, and in turn allows to seemingly channel some of his energy, or at least most of his energy, is much bigger than Will Payton's basically. So essentially, like, he can tap into more of that power than Will Payton can. And so the argument is we need to go to like 2 different points in time outside of the present day in order to access these various, remainders of the totality. Remember, this is an artifact that when it came flying through and landed on Earth in the main DC universe, it also breached the barriers of space and time, just because of the fact that space and time are synonymous. You can't have one without the other. And so it had basically left fractions of itself throughout the time stream, and the 2 big fractions they need would equal a power or seem to rival the power of Lex Luthor and give them a fighting chance. And so because of that, what the Justice League ends up doing is basically bringing together the entirety of its team, right? Like the whole totality of its team. You've got Shazam here, you've got like Black Canary, you've got Supergirl, you've got all these various characters here, all of whom are essentially like fighting on behalf of the Justice League and trying to see this mission come to its fruition. Now, this is where the explanation begins to come into play. And this is why it matters so much, is because what we end up finding out here from Will Payton, the way this plays out, is that at some point or another, Perpetua was basically created by what was called the Source, right? And the Source is one of these things that DC's never fully bothered to like go on and explain in its entirety. If you go back and you read the old Jack Kirby comics, right, the old Fourth World comics and things like that, the Source is basically God. But then you go into like the Vertigo line, and then like God is there. Like it's called the presence, right? So like God actually exists. For the most part, DC's kind of treated it insofar as the source is essentially God to a degree, and then like God has different aspects, right? So like God's judgment comes in the form of the Spectre, different things like that. DC really treats their kind of source of creation as a little more ambiguous. Regardless of the circumstance, the idea behind this was that the source essentially created Perpetua alongside of a host of other individuals that would go forward and essentially create like universes and multiverses, right? They would create life. So very Celestial-esque from Marvel Comics in terms of their form and function. The difference is that unlike the individuals that she fought beside, or at least kind of existed beside, Perpetua wanted to bring down the various, I guess, parents, for lack of a better word. And this essentially led to her creating like what would eventually become humans and Martians, right? In the sense that as Lex Luthor exists now, he's what Perpetua originally created. And then in turn, they basically split off as time went on. Then you got humans and you got Martians. As a result of that, Lex Luthor is kind of the first step in a return to the various kind of source of beings that Perpetua created. Ultimately, this led to a kind of civil war of sorts where you had Perpetua facing off against the Monitor, the Anti-Monitor, and the Forger of Worlds, and they in turn imprisoned her behind the Source Wall. Because of that, with the new multiverse basically being created as it exists now, kind of wiping away what she did, and then the Monitor, Anti-Monitor, and the Forger of Worlds creating like a new multiverse, this basically leads to things as they exist at the moment. So that's why you have the Speed Force, you've got the emotional spectrum as it exists, the various lantern cores that exist out there, everything outside of the ultraviolet lanterns basically. You've got the Sphere of Gods and presumably the Rock of Eternity and all that kind of good stuff. What Will Payton basically says is on the other side of that coin are basically all the 7 hidden energies of creation as they were used by Perpetua. Basically what she created when she created her dark multiverse, basically like her evil version of the multiverse more or less. And that's when you start getting into all the various forces that are kind of coming into fruition now, right? Like the Still Force, the Sage Force, all that kind of good stuff. Those are all the things that Lex Luthor can essentially tap into if he's able to harness like the full totality of what he can do. And that's why when you looked at the beginning of the story, the Justice League was utterly destroyed because they never really had a chance to face off against such a sheer level of power. And so with that being the case, what you've basically got here is you have a shard of the totality in the past, which the Justice League has to get, and then a shard of the totality in the future, which the Justice League has to get, and then bring them all together in the present day, and then presumably they'll stand a fighting chance. And so it's a cool little moment here, like when you get this explanation in terms of how it all works, which in reality, having like that condensed and concise explanation is kind of long overdue, right? Like having a whole one-shot comic that explains it but does it in a murky way is okay, but at the end of the day, like, especially me, I do much better when I have like a clear and concise short explanation on something, so I don't have to like hunt all over the place or try to decipher clues or different things like that. It's interesting, it kind of depends on the story. But the long and short of this is that with Lex Luthor's Legion of Doom fully assembled, the other half of this is they also know what the Justice League is doing. And the reason why is it really comes out of the issue before this, which isn't super important. I mean, it is important insofar as like what you learned from it, but basically Jarro had kind of taken over the Justice League to a degree. Anything insane, it wasn't like nefarious or anything like that, but Jarro is a small piece of Starro. And Starro had been destroyed at one point, but is basically regrowing under the control of Lex Luthor. And so because Starro is regrowing, he's able to reach out into his smaller little tidbits there, here and there, which comes in the form of Jarro. And because Jarro had taken over the minds of the Justice League, it means that Jarro read their minds, and in turn, Starro now knows everything the Justice League is going to do. So essentially, this battle's done before it's won. And it's kind of it's a cool little moment there, because what it does is it creates a branch, right? It creates the ability for the Legion of Doom to essentially use Starro as a means to spy on his Jarro counterpart and then watch the Justice League all the time. So this whole discussion that they've had, this whole plan that they've put together, with the help of Will Payton, is all now known by the Legion of Doom. And so it's basically like, okay, so like they're seemingly screwed. They're basically screwed. Like there's really not much they can do. At the same time, they've also got a saboteur in their ranks that when the portals are created that allow them to enter into the time stream, is basically sabotage. They don't end up exactly where they're supposed to, or at least it doesn't seem to be the case, right? You end up picking up with John Stewart and you pick up with the Flash, both of whom are, arrive in the past, but they don't arrive in the past as it's supposed to exist right now. They arrive in the past as if it's already been conquered by Perpetua and all of her various forces, right? So it's one of these weird little scenarios, because Hyper Time in DC is really like an overcomplicated mess. It was the attempt of DC to basically keep what they did after Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? Before Crisis on Infinite Earths, you had a multiverse. You had multiple realities, each one having its own version of the Justice League or any number of combinations, right? Having no Justice League at all. Having just like a series of heroes here and there and different things like that. When Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, DC eliminated all of that, right? They said, okay, there's only one universe. The issue is that it limited the heck out of their ability to write stories, right? Like, how do you write stories that are interesting, where they go to a far-flung future, or they go to some scenario where things played out differently, and so on and so forth. And so what ended up happening is with Mark Waid and a couple others, DC invented Hyper Time. And Hyper Time, if you can imagine it in your head is one of these points where if you start from point A and you go to point B, if you look at it as a single timeline, it's just point A to point B. It's a straight line. That's basically it. With hypertime, what you get is point A and then you curve up and come down to point B. And that curve is like some alternate reality where the Flash killed everybody. And then you've got one where it curves down from point A to point B. And that curve is an alternate reality where Superman killed everybody. It's a way for DC to basically say there's alternate timelines and they all branch off from a singular point in time, but they all coalesce and basically arrive in a guaranteed future. They're there, but it's like they're not there, right? I mean, it's like one of those things where no matter what you do, you can't change it, essentially. There's no way to undo that timeline. I think it's kind of murky, and I think it's a mess, and I think it's unnecessary, and I think it's overcomplicated in reality. Either pick alternate realities and just go with the Marvel formula, or don't, right? It's just Marvel's formula for alternate realities is infinitely easy to understand, right? Like branch universe theory. If it exists, there exists an alternate reality for it, and that alternate reality exists because something in the main Marvel universe happened that caused it. But regardless of the situation, you also end up picking up with Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, who of course are sent into this future, and in turn, like when they arrive there, the totality's conquered everything, and of course, they're rescued by Kid Kamandi. Now, the character of Kamandi, I guess Kamandi, I'm not really, I call it Kamandi. Maybe it's Kamandi. I'm not 100% sure how you pronounce it. But he basically comes from an old school comic that was actually self-titled, Kamandi, the ongoing series, which was launched in 1972. Technically, it was called Kamandi, the Last Boy on Earth. And the way this played out was that in this alternate reality, which I think was designated Earth 86, I'm not going to swear to that. I want to say there's two different iterations. There's Earth 86 and Earth 295. But basically, the long and short of it was that after this natural disaster, especially when it came to like radiation, the fallout of nuclear war, this essentially permeated a handful of animals, both being experimented on by a particular doctor, as well as whatever animals were left around the environment. And over the course of time, they became anthropomorphic. So think Planet of the Apes, except more than just apes. And in turn, this basically led to Kamandi being the last boy who was left on Earth, the last human being of sorts. What Scott Snyder really seems to be doing here, which I'm not avidly against it, is taking the concept of Kamandi and then just rolling it in right now and just kind of saying, okay, here's a more updated depiction of the character. He hails from a universe where the great cataclysm, the great, disaster that was prophesized by the people who inhabited Earth at the time before it all took place was actually the arrival of Perpetua and essentially the recreation of the multiverse, right? We can just kind of go with that and take it as an explanation. It works. Kamandi's obscure enough where Scott Snyder can really kind of do what he wants with him and then just sort of call it a day. Most people have probably never heard of him, right? Never heard of the character or anything along those lines. But the fact remains that when it comes to this, the arrival of the League here and basically being saved by these animal men essentially indicates that there is some measure of resistance against the forces of Perpetua and Lex Luthor and so on and so forth, which kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it'd be somewhat bleak and really hopeless if it turned out to be like a future, what was that? I keep wanting to say future imperfect, but that's not right. It's not called future imperfect. What is it called? Oh my God, Gordon, do not delete this segment. Like, people have to understand how my brain works and me trying to figure these things out, because I feel like there's fans right now who are screaming the name into their monitors. and or screaming the name into their phones or whatever, and I'm just sitting here like struggling. It's not Future's End. I think it is Future's End. I think that's what it's called. I can't remember. I got a little bit into it and I was like, this is garbage, and then closed it. Which I imagine most people won't disagree with. They'll just kind of be like, you were kind of right to make that call. That story's pretty bad. But it'd be different if it was something bleak like that, right? Where like everybody's screwed basically. But to have a kind of resistance force basically means that like there's still remnants out there. There's still factions out there. And if it's Kamandi and the Animal Men, well then there could be various other individuals out there. Now, it could also just be like Scott Snyder using this as a way to just kind of springboard a new Kamandi series, and just kind of like, we're going to talk about Kamandi now. And whether or not that's popular kind of remains to be seen. But here's the big takeaway from this, all right? Here's the big thing for all this. And then when I saw this, I almost popped. It was insane. Like I got to this and I was like, holy cow, right? So like you pick up with Jon Stewart and with the Flash and with this future they're looking at, in this landscape. So obviously we're talking about two different futures, but with this future that they're looking at in this landscape, like everything seems to be just like totally, kind of collapsed, and what's left of civilization is living in like huts and these little makeshift buildings and different things like that. And suddenly they're met by the arrival, like they have like this giant green ring that circles around them. And it's just like, okay, so like what in the world is going on? And my first thought when I saw this is I was like, okay, cool, like other guys who are going to be against like Perpetua and Lex and all them and whatever this multiverse is, or they're just kind of existing in this universe, whatever this universe happens to be. I'm kind of curious who these guys are going to be. I turned the page, it said it was the Justice Society of America, and I was like, what in the hell? Like dude, man, let me tell you something. Dude, my mind was blown. I was like, dude, this is bonkers, man. Dude, the JSA, and here's the thing, it's the whole JSA, right? Like San Sandman, Johnny Thunder, like Jay Garrick, Alan Scott, Dr. Fate. I was, dude, Hawkman. I was like, dude, what in the world is going on? That guy who's like the Panther looking guy that I never cared enough to learn about. Like, dude, it's crazy to see that. I was like, dude, this is nuts, man. So like the JSA is not really back insofar as they're back in the main DC universe. I think that's confined to Jeff Johns, but we get to see the JSA, man. Who cares how they appear, man? These dudes could all be wearing underpants and I'd be like, JSA, son, let's get to it. Dude, I'd be hyped. And I am hyped. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you guys drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.